Good morning, students. Today's topic is anatomy of middle ear, and it will take two video lectures to complete this topic. So today we will start with the part one of anatomy of middle ear, in which we'll discuss very briefly about the introduction, size and shape, that is dimension, paths, communications, contents, and boundaries of middle ear. So let's start with it. Now, what is middle ear? Middle ear is also known as tympanic cavity. Yes, middle ear is also known as tympanic cavity, and this is nothing but a narrow air filled space in between the external ear and the internal ear. This is the external ear. Yes, we have already discussed about it. This is the external ear, the pinna or the auricle, and the external auditory meatus, which comprises the external ear. Then we have the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. Okay, so this is the boundary, or this is the border in between, which separates the middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity from the external auditory meatus. Then we have this middle ear cavity, and this is the internal ear or the labyrinth. Okay, we'll discuss internal ear separately in a different video lecture. So to define middle ear, you have to write that middle ear or the tympanic cavity, or it can also be called as tympanum. So middle ear or tympanic cavity or tympanum is a narrow air filled space which is situated basically in the petrous part of the temporal bone. This is the temporal bone. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone in which this cavity is situated. So middle ear cavity is a narrow air filled space which is situated in the petrous part of the temporal bone in between the external ear and the internal ear. Now, what are its dimension? So first of all, we will talk about the shape. As you can see in this figure, that the middle ear is shaped like a cube. Yes, you can see in this figures that this is a cube. Okay, and talking about its lateral wall and the medial wall, this is the lateral wall and this is the medial wall. Okay, so talking about its lateral and medial walls, you can see these walls are very large as compared to the superior wall and the inferior wall. Okay, so when we will define the boundary or boundaries of middle ear or tympanic cavity, then you will come to know that the boundaries will be defined under the following heads, that is the roof, the floor. The superior wall forms the roof, the inferior wall will form the floor. Then we have the anterior wall, we have the posterior wall, then we have lateral wall, and we have medial wall. So the lateral and the medial wall is large, as you can see in this figure, but the other wall, that is the superior, the inferior, the anterior, and the posterior, they are narrow. Okay, that is why this whole cube is compressed from side to side. Yes, you can see that this cube is slightly compressed from side to side. Okay, and talking about the diameter or the dimensions now, so shape, you can write the shape is cube, is like a cube. The shape of the middle ear is like a cube, which is compressed from side to side due to broad lateral and medial walls. And dimensions, talking about dimensions, so we have anterior-posterior diameter and vertical diameter. The anterior-posterior diameter and the vertical diameter is same, that is 15 millimeters. Yes, the anterior-posterior diameter, this is the anterior wall, that was posterior wall. So this is the anterior-posterior diameter, this is 15 millimeter, and this is the vertical diameter in between the superior wall and the inferior wall, and it is also 15 millimeters. And when you see in coronal section, this side is showing a coronal section of the middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity. So and you can see this coronal section is biconcave. Yes, this is biconcave in shape, and the lateral wall and the medial wall is closest to each other in the middle of it. Yes, so the distance separating these two lateral or medial walls above will be 6 millimeter, below or downwards will be 4 millimeter, and in the center is approximately 2 millimeters. Okay, so this is all about the shape and size of tympanic cavity. Now moving on to parts. So tympanic cavity is divided into two parts: the tympanic cavity proper and the epitympanic recess. So this tympanic cavity proper is the area or is the part of the tympanic cavity which is just opposite to the tympanic membrane. This is the tympanic membrane, you can see in this figure. So this is the tympanic membrane, and just opposite to this tympanic membrane, the area of the tympanic cavity is called as tympanic cavity proper. It is written here as tympanic cavity, but it should be tympanic cavity proper. And the area which is above the level of this tympanic membrane, this is tympanic membrane, so above this level, above the level of tympanic membrane, the area of the tympanic cavity is termed as epitympanic recess, and this epitympanic recess has the major part of the malleus and the incus. These two are the ear ossicles, which is three in numbers: incus, malleus, incus, and stapes. Okay, so the major part of the malleus and the incus will reside in this epitympanic recess, which lies above the level of this tympanic membrane. So tympanic cavity has two parts: tympanic cavity proper at the level of tympanic membrane, and epitympanic recess, which is above the level of tympanic membrane. Now, as I have already told you that this middle ear cavity is in between the external ear and the internal ear. So, this is a communication. This cavity forms a communication with this anterior, the external ear and the internal ear. Okay, so the communication, the middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity communicates anteriorly with the nasopharynx. Okay, with the nasopharynx through this auditory tube. Yes, or the eustachian tube. So this eustachian tube communicates the middle ear cavity. This is the middle ear cavity, the pink colored one, the cubical one. This is the middle ear cavity. This is the posterior or the internal ear, you can say, and this is the external. This is the internal ear. This is the external ear, towards external ear, towards internal ear. Okay, and this is the middle ear cavity. Now this auditory tube or the eustachian tube, this communicates middle ear cavity or tympanic cavity with the anteriorly with the nasopharynx. Now talking about the posterior communication, so this adductus to antrum, yes, this adductus will communicate this tympanic cavity to the mastoid antrum or the antrum. Yes, this is the mastoid antrum, and through this adductus, this middle ear cavity or tympanic cavity communicates posteriorly with this mastoid antrum or mastoid air cells. Yes, the mastoid antrum and the mastoid air cells too. Okay, now you can see in the figure B that the middle ear is likely to be a pistil in the sloping course of the adductus. Yes, so this is the adductus, and this is the sloping course of the adductus, and in this you can see that this is the internal ear. Okay, so this whole figure resembles like a pistil in which the middle ear cavity seems to be like a trigger. Yes, the internal ear, the mastoid antrum, or you can say the mastoid antrum or the mastoid air cells will form the handle of the pistol. The auditory tube will form the passage for the bullet. Okay, and the middle ear cavity will act like a trigger. Okay, so this is a sketch just to explain you the communications of this middle ear cavity anteriorly with the nasopharynx and posteriorly with the mastoid antrum. Now discussing the contents of middle ear. So middle ear cavity or tympanic cavity firstly has three ear ossicles, which I have already told you. the names are the malleus. This is the malleus. Yes, if you remember the external ear in which we have already discussed about tympanic membrane, then you can memorize, you can easily recognize that this handle of malleus is forming the handle of malleus is forming the a border in between the anterior fold and the posterior fold of the tympanic membrane, and the tip of this handle of malleus forms the point of maximum convexity at the tympanic membrane, that is called umbo. Okay, so there are three ear ossicles, which is the main component or main content of middle ear cavity: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Okay, so the upper part, that is the epitympanic recess. The epitympanic recess has the greater part of the incus and the malleus. Yes, you can see this is the incus and this is the malleus. So the head of the incus and malleus, the greater part of these will be in the epitympanic recess. Now, apart from these three bones or the ear ossicles, and when I'll deal with the ear ossicles, there are some very interesting facts regarding ear ossicles in human body. So I'll not go in detail of ear ossicles in this lecture. We'll deal with it separately in the part 2 of middle ear. Going back to the contents of middle ear now, apart from these three bones or the ear ossicles, we have the ligaments that supports these ear ossicles. You can see this is the posterior ligament of the incus, supporting the incus posteriorly. We have the superior ligament of the malleus. Then we have anterior ligament of the malleus. Similarly, we have the ligament which is attached to the stapedius muscle, and then we have the tensor tympani muscle ligament which is attached to the tensor tympani muscle too. Okay, so these are some ligaments which is also considered as a content of the middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity. And these two muscles, these are the two muscles of the tympanic cavity, the stapedius and the tensor tympani muscle. These two muscles also is a content of middle ear cavity or tympanic cavity. And then we have some vessels, that is arteries and veins, which supplies and drains this middle ear cavity or tympanic cavity. And we have this cauda tympani nerve along with this tympanic plexus. Tympanic plexus is not here labeled here or is visualized here. So this cauda tympanic nerve, as you can see here, this cauda tympanic nerve is the nerve considered to be a content of middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity. Now, discussing the boundary, as I've already told you while defining the dimensions or the shape of middle ear, that the boundaries will be discussed having a roof, a floor, then we have an interior wall, a posterior wall, and we have a lateral as well as medial wall. So in this figure you can easily define the interior wall, that is also called as the carotid wall. Yes, you can also very easily define the anterior wall or the carotid wall. We can see the roof, that is also called as the tegmental wall. We can define the floor, that is called as jugular wall. And we can also define the posterior wall, that is called as mastoid wall. And we have the medial wall. Okay, so this medial wall, which is also called as the labyrinth wall. Okay, so in this figure we will define all these boundaries except the lateral wall, which will be defined in the forthcoming slide, in the next slide. So firstly we'll start with the roof. Okay, so the roof or the tegmental wall, this is the roof or the tegmental wall which separates this middle ear cavity from the middle cranial fossa. If you remember the lecture regarding skull, regarding basically base of skull, then you can easily rememorize that the cranial fossa is divided into three parts: the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. So the roof or the tegmental wall of this tympanic cavity separates the middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity from the middle cranial fossa. This is the middle cranial fossa, and this is the tympanic cavity, and this roof is the separation of tympanic cavity from the middle cranial fossa. Now, this roof is basically formed by a thin plate of bone which is called as tegmen tympani. Yes, you can see this label. This is called as tegmen tympani, which is a very thin plate of bone, and this plate of bone is prolonged backwards. You can see this is ascending backwards and prolonging backwards as the roof of the canal for tensor tympani. Yes, as the roof of the canal for tensor tympani. This is the canal for tensor tympani, and you can see this is prolonging backwards as the roof for the canal of tensor tympani too. Okay, so this is tegmen tympani, which is a thin plate of bone which separates the middle ear cavity from the middle cranial fossa. Now talking about the floor, so this is the floor. Where I am moving my cursor, this is the floor or the jugular wall. And why it is called as jugular wall? Because this floor is also formed by a very thin plate of bone. You can see this is a very thin plate of bone also, and it separates the middle ear cavity. It separates this middle ear cavity from the superior bulb of this jugular vein, internal jugular vein. This is internal jugular vein. You can see, you can trace the course, and this is the bulb. This is the bulb or the superior bulb of the jugular vein, also labeled as or also called as jugular bulb. Okay, so this jugular bulb is separated from the middle ear cavity with the help of this floor of tympanic cavity, and this floor is also called as jugular wall. That is why this floor is also called as jugular wall, and this plate of bone is a part of temporal bone. Now towards its medial side, towards the medial, moving towards the medial of this floor or the jugular wall or the jugular plate, there is a canaliculi. There is a canaliculi known as tympanic canaliculus. Okay, so this tympanic canaliculus, this is transmitting the tympanic branch of the ninth cranial nerve, that is glossopharyngeal nerve. This is the ninth cranial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and this glossopharyngeal nerve, this basically this is the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve, uh, which is transmitting through this tympanic canaliculus, which is medial to the floor of this tympanic cavity or the jugular wall of this tympanic cavity. Now moving or discussing the anterior wall or the carotid wall. Why it is known as carotid wall, you can you will come to know this. You can see this carotid artery. So this is the anterior wall and also known as carotid wall. So this carotid wall basically you can see is very narrow, and why it is so narrow? Because there are two reasons for this. The first one is that tegmen tympani, as you can see, this tegmen tympani is descending. Okay, so this tegmen tympani is descending downwards towards the anterior wall. That is why this is the reason that this anterior wall is narrow. And the medial and the lateral wall, I have already told you that the approximation of the medial and the lateral wall is there also. So the anterior wall is very narrow. Okay, because the medial and the lateral wall also compresses bimanually, and the descent of the roof is also another reason for this narrow anterior wall or the carotid wall. Now talking about the uppermost part of this anterior wall. So the uppermost part of this anterior wall bears an opening for the canal of tensor tympani. This is the canal of tensor tympani, and there is an opening for this canal of tensor tympani. Okay, and the bony septum there. Firstly, we'll talk about the second opening, that is the opening for the canal of the Eustachian tube or the auditory tube. So the lower part, the inferior middle part, you can say the middle part has the opening for the canal of the auditory tube. Okay, so this is the topmost part, uppermost part. This is the middle part, which has the opening for the canal of auditory tube or the Eustachian tube. In between the middle part and the anterior part, there is bony septum. You can see this is a bony septum in between the upper part, the canal of for the tensor tympani and the canal for the auditory tube. And this bony septum is called as processus cochleariformis. What? Processus cochleariformis. Now, talking about the lowermost part, so the inferior part of the wall is formed by a very thin plate. Yes, is formed by a very thin plate of bone, which forms the posterior wall of the carotid canal. Okay, this is the carotid artery, internal carotid artery, which is residing in the carotid canal, and this is the thin walled bone which is forming the posterior wall of the carotid canal. This is the carotid canal in which there is internal carotid artery with the sympathetic plexus, and this is the posterior wall of this carotid canal, which is formed by the in very thin plate of bone, which is in the inferior part of this anterior wall. Now this plate, this plate separates the middle ear cavity from the internal carotid artery. You can see this is the middle ear cavity and this is the internal carotid artery, and this plate is separating this middle ear cavity from the internal carotid artery or the carotid canal, you can say. And this plate of bone, you can see, is perforated by some structures. This plate of bone is perforated by the two sympathetic carotico-tympanic nerves, yes, and the tympanic branch of the internal carotid artery. Okay, so the tympanic branch of the internal carotid artery and the two sympathetic carotico-tympanic nerves will perforate this plate in the inferior part of the anterior wall of tympanic cavity. Okay, so this is all about the anterior wall. Now moving on to the posterior wall. Okay, moving on to the posterior wall. So posterior wall has superiorly, the posterior wall has the adductus, which I have already told you, which basically communicates the epitympanic recess with the mastoid antrum. So here is the adductus. Okay, it is not labeled in this figure. Adductus will communicate the tympanic membrane or the you can say sorry, not tympanic membrane but tympanic cavity, and you can say the upper part of the tympanic cavity, that is the epitympanic recess, to the tympanic antrum. Okay, now there is a conical projection. See here in this figure you can see a conical projection which is labeled as pyramid. This conical projection, which is called as pyramid, this lies at the junction of the posterior and the medial wall. This is the posterior wall and this is the medial wall. This is the medial wall, this is the posterior wall. So at the junction of these two walls there is a conical projection that is called as pyramid, and this pyramid has an opening at its apex or the tip for the passage of the tendon of stapedius. Okay, this opening is not labeled in this figure. And lateral to this pyramid, talking about moving on, lateral to this pyramid near the posterior edge of tympanic membrane, there is a posterior canaliculi for the chorda tympani nerve. Okay, so there is a posterior canaliculi for the chorda tympani nerve, and through which this nerves basically enters the middle ear cavity. Okay, so lateral to this pyramid there is a, you can say there is a canaliculus which is known as posterior canaliculus, and this posterior canaliculus is the way for chorda tympani nerve which enters the middle ear cavity through this posterior canaliculi. Okay. Now going on to this medial wall, talking on to this medial wall. So this medial wall separates the middle ear cavity from the internal ear. Okay. So this medial wall separates the middle ear cavity from the internal ear, and basically it has this round bulging structure known as promontory. Yes, you can see this round bulging structure. It is labeled as promontory, and this promontory is produced by the first turn of the cochlea. When you will study about the labyrinth or the internal ear, then you will discuss cochlea in that, and the first round or the first turn of the cochlea will form the promontory. Okay, this promontory is grooved by the tympanic plexus. This is, you can see, this is the tympanic plexus, these plexus of veins, and these are grooving this promontory. Now there are three openings in this medial wall, and the first one is the fenestra vestibuli. Yes, fenestra vestibuli, the largest one. This fenestra vestibuli is, as you can see, is an oval opening which is postero superior to the promontory. Postero superior. Okay, this is superior, this is inferior, and this is postero superior. So postero superior to this promontory, there is an oval opening which is known as fenestra vestibuli, and this opening will lead the vestibule of the internal ear. This opening will lead or will communicate the middle ear cavity towards the vestibule of the internal ear, and is closed by the foot plate of stapes. Okay, an ear ossicle, the smallest one. Now talking about the second opening, that is the fenestra cochlea. This fenestra cochlea is, as you can see, is some more rounded or circular opening, not properly oval opening. So this fenestra cochlea, this is a circular or round opening at the bottom of a depression posterior inferior to the promontory. Yes, so this is at the bottom of the posterior inferior to the bottom of the promontory, and this rounded opening communicates or opens into the scala tympani of the cochlea. Okay, these terms, the scala tympani, the cochlea, these terms will be discussed in the internal ear. Don't get panic, just remember the terms here. These terms will be explained in the forthcoming video lectures, and or the video lecture for the internal ear. Now this fenestra cochlea opens into the scala tympani of the cochlea, and this is closed by a membrane which is called as the secondary tympanic membrane. Now there is also a third opening, or you can say a depression, which is known as sinus tympani, and this sinus tympani is a depression which is behind the promontory. This is promontory, and this, behind this we have a sinus, or we have a depression which is known as sinus tympani. And this sinus tympani is also at the opposite of the ampulla of the posterior semicircular canal. So this semicircular canal also we will discuss in the internal ear. So when we will discuss, as I have started, explaining you the middle, or sorry, the medial wall or the labyrinth wall, then at that time I have told you that the medial wall communicates or separates the middle ear or tympanic cavity from the internal ear. So when we'll study the internal ear in detail, then you will come to know about all these terms which I have used in this, that is the cochlea, the semicircular canal, the scala tympani. All these terms will be more cleared in the video lecture for internal ear. Now there is a prominence of the facial canal, or you can see this is the facial canal, and the prominence of this facial canal runs backwards. This is the facial canal, and the prominence of this, you can see, is running backwards and downwards. Okay, and this will reach to the lower margin of the auditus. Okay, you can see this is reaching towards the lower margin of the auditus, and then it will descend behind this posterior wall. It will descend behind the posterior wall or the mastoid wall, and will reach or end at the stylomastoid foramen. Okay, so this is the facial canal or the prominence of the facial canal, which lies or runs backwards just above the fenestra vestibuli. Yes, you can see this is running backwards just above the fenestra vestibuli, and it will run downwards or descend downwards behind the posterior wall or the mastoid wall, and ends at the stylomastoid foramen. Okay, now, last but not the least, we'll discuss the lateral boundary. This figure is showing the lateral boundary or the membranous wall or the lateral wall. So, the lateral wall separates the middle ear cavity from the external acoustic meatus, that, or you can say external ear. So, the lateral wall is separating the middle ear from the external ear, and this lateral wall is formed by mainly by the tympanic membrane. This tympanic membrane, then along with this tympanic membrane there is tympanic ring and sulcus. Yes, and partly by the squamous temporal bone. Yes, partly by the squamous temporal bone in the region of epitympanic recess. Okay, so these two bones and the membrane, tympanic membrane, these two structure will form the lateral wall, which separates the middle ear cavity from the external acoustic meatus or the external ear. Now, near the tympanic notch, there are two small apertures. Okay, near this tympanic notch, there are two small apertures. This the first one is the petrotympanic fissure. Okay, petrotympanic fissure, which lies in front of the upper end of the bony rim. This is the bony septum or the rim, you can see, and this upper end of the bony septum of the rim. In front of this, we have an aperture which is known as petrotympanic fissure, and it lodges the anterior process or the anterior ligament of the malleus, or anterior process of the malleus, and transmits the tympanic branch of maxillary artery. Tympanic branch of maxillary artery is not visible here, but you can see anterior ligament of the malleus and the petrotympanic fissure. Okay, so this is the petrotympanic fissure, which has this anterior ligament of the malleus. Now, the second one is the anterior canaliculi. Okay, the anterior canaliculi for the chorda tympani, and this anterior canaliculi for the chorda tympani has the chorda tympani nerve, and it is either in the fissure or just in front of it. This is the chorda tympanic nerve. You can see that this nerve is in the fissure in this figure. So sometimes it is within the fissure and sometimes it is in front of this fissure. Okay, so this is the anterior canaliculus, which is another aperture found in within this lateral wall or the membranous wall of the tympanic cavity. Now, the nerve, this chorda tympanic nerve, as you can see, this leaves the anterior canaliculi, and this leaves the middle ear basically through this canaliculi and enters into the base of the skull. Okay, or emerges into the base of the skull. So this chorda tympanic nerve is entering the middle ear cavity through the posterior canaliculi and is emitting out or emerging out from this middle ear cavity through this anterior canaliculi. Okay, so this is all for today. In next video lecture, we will discuss about the ear ossicles in detail. Apart from that, we will also discuss about the joints of the ossicles, the muscles of middle ear. Then we'll deal with the arterial supply, venous drainage, lymphatics, and nerve supply of middle ear. And last but not the least, we'll discuss some important clinical anatomy of middle ear. Till then, stay home, stay healthy, take care. Thank you so much.